Aphoristic appendage to On Truthtelling. 551 to 600. 551. One principle that belligerent nations have followed since time immemorial is, while doing wrong themselves, accuse the enemy of the worst things imaginable. 552. Virtually all discourses and, in particular, formal ones are inflected by the moral sensibilities of the age. Very often this inclination, which can also be viewed as an affectation, takes the form of duly noting, one doesn't let it slip by in conversation, in other words, some socially approved thought or sentiment. Yes, of course, I strongly uphold X and categorically condemn Y, but it seems to me. Such a manner of speaking is particularly evident when a point or issue comes up that can't be avoided and that, in however slight or trivial a way, runs counter to the prevailing narrative. 553. Morality is the age-old practice which, at the very least, has the inbuilt tendency of identifying local values with what is or should be everywhere and for all time. 554. What? You say that being a partisan doesn't rule out telling the truth of a matter. Quite right. But there is never just one matter, there are always many, and so. 555. If it's true great leaders can do great wrong, it's also true that, apart from a few exceptions and what gets written in history books, they won't be brought to account for it. 556. Apart from all other considerations, being a dyed-in-the-wool partisan or a person with prejudices is simply the outcome of limited means. Give everyone unlimited resources in the way of time, energy, intellect, and inclination and see what a sea change there would be. 557. When we stop communicating for some reason, often barely understood, with a longtime friend, family member, or loved one, it's often with the thought that, with a bit of luck, things will change, and the situation reverse itself. But quite often it doesn't, and the years go by, death all of a sudden intervening and ending the matter. It's almost as if, without knowing it and often long before this final rupture, we were saying to them, it was great while it lasted. See you in eternity. 558. Yes, it's a hard thought to bear. Not only is life full of the good fortune of some and the misfortune of others, but something far more radical, namely, that the good fortune of some is wholly dependent on, not possible without, the misfortune of others. And to go even further, what if this some is in fact all? 559. If great works of the past such as the Sphinx and the pyramids are mysteries, then how much more so the great works of nature? 560. Yes, it seems to be the case that, just as there are many people who find it easier to think than to feel, so there are many people who find it easier to feel than to think. Should it be any surprise then if all their values, or at least a good many of them, follow from this? And, further, should it be any surprise if, on this basis, there's a natural divide between people? 561. Could there be such a thing as an absolutely intolerable and destructive truth? How about this one? Everything is ultimately inseparable from everything else. 562. The sort of ideological protest yet to come before the deluge might be, just think of all the animals who don't have any say in what people do to them. And you call this democracy? 563. The controversial scholar became a star because he spoke exceedingly well on a certain number of issues. Later, he became an even bigger star and spoke very well on a much larger number of issues. Finally, he became a veritable superstar and, although he still spoke well on a large number of issues, he also spoke not so well on some and even rather badly on a few. 564. A paradox: if the values of cultural and ethnic diversity became universal, there would be no diversity of values. 565. Oh, you don't think that morality can be commodified? Just imagine for a moment a law being passed that would ban the use of all highly charged words from the media. Chances are that much of what they write or talk about would then become as non-profitable as this aphorism. 566. There seem to be both a certain amount of stupidity and a certain amount of wisdom in all attempts to grasp the whole. Stupidity from the point of view that these attempts are doomed to fail, wisdom from the point of view that they always have a certain amount of practical, social, or political value. 567. Yes, there's much in the news today that's controversial, but it's also highly repetitive. It's easy to make the prediction then that people will eventually get bored with it. 568. With a sufficiently broad view of the matter, it's just as reasonable to think of dying as going to heaven and becoming a star as it is to think of it as bodily decay and decomposition. 569. At every stage of one's life there are things one can do that one couldn't do before and things one did before that one can no longer do. The trick is to give the first way of looking at the matter center stage rather than the second. 570. When we are enjoying the good things of life, we tend to think they will last forever. It's as if we purposely blind ourselves to all the evidence around us and imagine that we alone, for some mysterious reason, are exempt. 571. Christianity in the Middle Ages helped people into life, through life, and out of life. 572. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes the different means of torture used against political prisoners in Soviet Russia, it makes Dante's Inferno look like a visit to an amusement park. 573. Every teaching or doctrine can catch a glimpse of the whole, which is to say it can make some significant claims about what is true. That's why so much is not entirely unacceptable or bereft of followers and defenders. Of course, a partisan won't accept this. They must maintain their point of view in the face of all others, including what's contained in this aphorism. 574. There are people who suffer daily from one thing or another or even have suffered all their lives. How can we, who have always enjoyed good health and relative security and stability, ever identify with them? But, one insists, there is a moral obligation to do so. It sometimes gets the name of pity or compassion. Let us admit that there is this obligation. But, for most of us, will it ever be anything more than a passing affair? Should it be anything more? As ever, the devil is in the details. Framing universal notions about how one should behave always works better in theory than it does in practice. 575. Man's fate can be summed up as angelic considerations, devilish details, results that can be everything and anything. 576. No doubt there are at least a few religious people who secretly commit heinous acts. If they are not complete monsters, they will likely think that God, who can look into their hearts, will forgive them their trespasses. On the other hand, they know very well that society won't be so tolerant. Could it be these people who are essentially living double lives know in their heart of hearts that, whereas they are basing their outlook on intentions, society will base the morality of their position on consequences or even perceived consequences and the need for both correction and deterrence? 577. An aphorism should avoid everyday language on current issues because, often enough, it is riddled with assumptions never recognized as such. 578. To say things without varnish and in the simplest possible way, sex can only become a major preoccupation when one has a full stomach, comfortable living quarters, a healthy body, and a mind untroubled by other concerns. 579. Instruction, persuasion, and coercion make up the cocktail of social coherence. 580. To think there have been societies where people have been imprisoned and executed simply for having, or even merely suspected of having, the wrong religious or political beliefs. 581. Think of those dried up things called Egyptian mummies. And then think of the people who built the pyramids. Magnificence, morbidity, and mortality all rolled into one. 582. Take up a position in life and a way of thinking is almost forced on you. 583. And then there are those feats of earlier humanity hardly known or thought of by most of us. The fact that, for example, people started spreading out from one part of the world hundreds of thousands of years ago and by making long and arduous journeys, by crossing deserts, mountains, rivers, seas, oceans, and polar regions, eventually found new homes and new lives. 584. It seems that James Joyce wrote his notoriously difficult novel, Finnegan's Wake, with himself in view as the only person who would ever fully understand it. 585. Make no mistake about it. When having to deal with foreign elements considered unfriendly or hostile, most politicians, whether they be on the right or the left, prefer to come across as being tough and aggressive rather than fair and reasonable. 586. Yes, it's true. In politics as in other areas, one can criticize until the cows come home. But to put something in place that works, that's always another matter. On the other hand, one should always be careful what one puts in place, especially in politics. It could always turn out to be monstrous. Indeed, there is yet another dimension potentially tragic or even catastrophic. It's that when something is put in place, it develops its own logic and momentum, often becoming indifferent to other concerns. When something is working relatively well in society, it's best to be careful how one goes about making it even better. 587. When it comes to implementing and enforcing certain policies, administrators are often very conservative in the sense that open-mindedness and free expression are not what's given priority but rather scrupulous attention and fidelity to the prevailing way of thinking. 588. In all partisanship, no matter how fair and honest it may be, a false note must slip in for the simple reason that it can never quite do justice to what it opposes. 589. There are people who, if we were intimate with their lives from beginning to end, such as we often are with the brothers or sisters, would make us love them even if we hate them. 590. And he said of his brother in later years, when he was more fun-loving than full of himself, I loved him. 591. Yes, they are young and foolish. They have strength in numbers and are violent in the name of good with reasons they can barely articulate beyond slogans. So, what else is new? 592. The will to truth is inextricably tied to the will to power. How could it be otherwise when the claim to know the truth is virtually synonymous with the claim to have the right to act in accordance with it? 593. Let's say certain things, such as diplomatic relations and international affairs, particularly at the highest political level, are treated as one giant high-stakes game. Would it not be relatively easy then for the players to pardon themselves for even those acts that, under most circumstances, would be called evil? 594. When we're young, all that we do seems everything. When older, a passing glory. 595. Attacking the injustices of a system is one thing, replacing it with a system that doesn't give birth to its own is another. 596. Inbuilt to all polemics is the willingness to slug it out and even throw mud if necessary. 597. A quick conversation cuts corners. Truth is therefore compromised even by the best speakers. On the other hand, long, slow conversations take the risk of being less interesting. Truth is no more separable from interest, or from interests, than it is from power. B. When you talk like this, you sound like a postmodernist. A. I certainly have one foot in that camp, but I also have one in another. After all, I have my own set of interests just like everyone else. Who will compromise on their personal interests unless forced to? 598. Could it be that current issues such as the threat of global warming, which is spoken of as a matter of grave concern mainly by those on the left, and the threat of globalization, which is spoken of in similar terms mainly by those on the right, are, at least as they are laid down to the general public and successful in reaching a large number of people, royal falsehoods? It must be so for no other reason than that exaggeration and repetition, along with raising the alarm, are highly effective ways of influencing people. 599. Rest assured that, whether they be on the right or the left, a person or party that acquires godlike powers will exercise them, at certain moments, like the devil incarnate. 600. A party or faction that wants to change the world but faces serious opposition, and when isn't there serious opposition, has no choice if it wants to succeed but play the tyrant. Ultimately, its moral position boils down to that tried and true principle, the end justifies the means.